Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives, episode 121. I'm Heidi Kuda, and today Jim and Hi-Fi and I are interviewing our very good friend, Dr. Michael MacKay, a geopolitical analyst who has lived in Ukraine. Today, we are going to be discussing the first decade of World War III. Have a listen. Dr. Michael MacKay, welcome so much back to RadPod. We're so happy to see you today. And as we've been saying to some of our recent guests, we are sorry to be seeing you under these circumstances. You, for a decade, have been warning about what could potentially happen. And every step of the way, unfortunately, you've been proven correct. When I interviewed you 2 years ago and you said that Musk was going to be turning Twitter into Vkontakte, a Russian propaganda outlet in the form of a social media under the guise of a social media platform, you were, of course, right. But let's just jump into, you have been doing this work, reporting daily on events in Ukraine for 2014, and you actually lived there during some of the most important, momentous recent events in the last 20 years. And let's start there. Let's walk people through what you know about this Russian aggression and the spread of it globally, and all the things that we should have done and could be doing now. So let's start kind of maybe 20 years ago, 2004.
Okay, yeah, I could start almost anywhere. Of course, I've become more known from Twitter for the last decade, but in the pre-social media era, active in many other ways, pretty much since the renewal of independence just after 1991. But let's start in 2004, for example. That was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and I think it's important to remember how it got started. Russia engaged in an active measure to put across their candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, as the president, and they falsified the runoff election. As many of these countries do, they, many presidential candidates, and if one of them doesn't get 50% plus one, there's a runoff between the top two, and then the winner becomes the president. And that presidential runoff was falsified, and it was blatantly done so. And this was a surprise to people at the time because people weren't really aware. And they had a sense that maybe the oligarchs were involved or something like that, because it was clear Yanukovych was friendly from them. But the ties to the Russians were not actually obvious, although people at the time knew that the Russians had poisoned Yushchenko, and disfigured him terribly as a result of that. Anyway, there was an international effort to do a repeat runoff election. And thankfully, Ukrainian electoral law allowed for such a thing. And the Constitutional Court made this possible. And I went over as an election observer. And the repeat runoff, which was just the day after Christmas, it was fairly conducted, and Yushchenko won. Which was the result that the first one had, but it was not obvious. But one interesting thing that happened, and why people were not able to really digest what had just happened in Ukraine, is the day after that election, there was the large tsunami in the Indian Ocean, and that just took over the news cycle. And so what happened afterwards, digesting this incredible outpouring of direct democracy in Ukraine, which was the Orange Revolution. I saw the aftermath of this, the encampments on Maidan. This was one of the Maidans that Ukraine has become famous for. And Ukrainians, of course, were directly involved with what happened here, but the rest of the world didn't pick up on it. And so when subsequently the Russians got more engaged and did a better job at influencing Ukrainian politics and manipulating their elections, Putin brought in Paul Manafort to be a curator for Yanukovych, remade his image a little bit. And by 2010, and I was at that election as observer as well, Yanukovych defeated Yulia Tymoshenko. And I thought of that as and then after that, Yanukovych initiated the lock her up movement regarding Tymoshenko and so on. And that'll be familiar to Americans from after the 2016 election and, well, actually during and after it. And I guess fast forward 4 years after that, 2013, 2014, Yanukovych suddenly pulled out of the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was the first step towards Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union, free trade and visa-free travel and things like this. And by the way, this and that led to Euromaidan, which then, because of brutal police crackdowns, morphed into the Revolution of Dignity. By the way, the same thing is happening in Georgia right now, because the Georgian Dream, the pro-Russian faction, summarily pulled out of Georgia's process of joining the European Union
Wow.
after they stole the election right there. So the Revolution of Dignity, as it became known, there were several days of million-plus crowds in Maidan, and it spread to other cities in Ukraine. Yanukovych lost control over the security forces. He never had control of the army. And he fled on February 20th, 2014, on instructions from Putin. He flew away from his equivalent of Mar-a-Lago in a helicopter. And the very same day, Putin launched the operation to invade Ukraine in Crimea. So he minted a medal for special operations forces to give the starting date of World War III, which we're in now, which was February 20th, 2014. 10 years after that, here we are, and the war is bigger than ever.
Okay, so thank you so much for that very succinct grounding for where this interview is going to be going. I know Jim and High Fidelity have questions, but one of the things I would like to ask you is, we have seen this duplicated over and over again, Russia interfering in elections, not even really doing much to hide it. And you just mentioned Georgia going through the same thing right now. And I would love for you just to run down that list that you delivered to Hi-Fi on the various countries that Russia has done this to. And why is there this disconnect and this paralysis in America? We're not special. It can happen here. It has happened here. And maybe if you run down some of the countries it's happened to, it might sort of like inspire America to wake up that it not only can, but has happened here, and what we need to do. You mentioned 1 million plus people on Maidan. We are interviewing you middle of December. We still have a month to go before this organized crime ring, as Jim says, will be, doing a decapitation strike on our country. So please, remind people, this is not unique.
Yes, yeah, and well, and I think that's important to take the perspective of Russia, because Russia is at war. And a major part of their war is active measures or so-called hybrid warfare. In fact, that is the overwhelming part of it. As we can see, when it comes to conventional warfare, their war in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent in Syria as well, they're actually not very good at that at all. They're terrible. When you think about it, Ukraine's army in 2014 was hopelessly corrupt after many years of Yanukovych, understaffed, had no provision to really defend the country, filled with Soviet-trained officers and so on. And nevertheless, that force, with the addition of volunteers, slowed down and eventually stopped the Russian invasion, so that they were able to capture Crimea, but they were not able to totally capture Luhansk and Donetsk. And the wars kind of stayed that way for the following 8 years. But they are very good at active measures. And I started to track this really carefully after my experience, on social media, after my experience of being in Ukraine during the Revolution of Dignity, and then the subsequent election where Poroshenko became the president. And I started to see that the Russians are also not very imaginative. They do the same thing in other places. And it's really not all that sophisticated. So for example, 2016 is a year when I really started to see things pick up. That was the first thing in 2016, and people forget this now. There was a referendum in the Netherlands, and it was started by basically a comedy outfit who realized that they could manipulate Netherlands' very generous referendum laws just by getting enough names on a signature. And although both Ukraine and Moldova were candidates for an association agreement, which Ukraine was now, both countries were getting ready to go with now that Yanukovych was out, they decided to have a referendum against Ukraine. They didn't mention Moldova and the association agreement. And the Russians just poured money into this. Now, the Dutch people were not particularly interested, but I think Americans are very familiar with this. When you have low turnout in elections or referenda, it is very easy to manipulate it to extremist results. And that referendum won. Now, the government of Mark Rutte, who is now, by the way, the Secretary General of NATO, they managed to bob and weave and kind of fudge things so that the Netherlands stayed more or less on board. But it was a huge embarrassment for the Netherlands. The next thing in 2016 was Brexit. And Russia illegally financed Vote Leave. This was the campaign to vote leave. And Nigel Farage, a good friend of Trump, and people like that. And how did they get away with it? Okay, well, one thing, a big mistake of the Brexit referendum was it was not legally binding. It was considered an advisory referendum. So although the British courts ruled that this was illegal funding, they got away with it. And it's just astonishing. And although it was not legally binding, the government at the time, the Conservative government, just said, oh, we're going to do that. We're going to do Brexit, even though it was just barely above the majority threshold. So it was just, and that was an astonishing victory for Russia to bring about Brexit. And as I said, Russians didn't cause that sentiment in Britain. Well, of course they didn't. That's not the way they operate. They're not that clever. Russians do not cause these catastrophes. They're not even really arsonists that set fire to things. They're the person who comes to the scene of the arson after it's already there and just pours more gasoline on it, right? That's how simple their active measures are. So, and we can see that in a place like the United States, where you can say, let me see, how can they derail Black Lives Matter? I know there have been some incidents of violence, and some people write against, there's been looting or rioting here and there. And all you do is just set up websites, fake web news websites, you promote the speakers, and then before you know it, it's this extreme, Black Lives Matter is this extremist movement prone to violence. And the original of the idea was about, fairness of policing and things like that, totally lost, right? And you say, oh, well, the Russians didn't cause racism in America. Well, of course they didn't. Don't need to, right? Okay, so I'm getting a little distracted here, but
no, that is an incredibly brilliant point that people need to always remember about, and that whole pouring of gasoline on to the fires that we're creating is really, really an important point. Please keep going.
Yeah. So, yeah, it is. So anyway, in 2016, again, this is a minor point, kind of lost because of the size of the United States and so on. But a week before, Russia succeeded in bringing their man into power in Moldova, and that was Dodon. That was against a woman candidate. And I was writing at the time, and I say, oh, this is exactly what's happening in the US, Trump versus Hillary Clinton. And it's exactly Moldova. Of course, Americans don't pay any attention to Moldova. Why would they? Small, poor country in Europe. But from the Russian point of view, which I want people to understand, they saw it as the same thing. It's absolutely the same for them. They didn't spend any effort saying that this guy Dodon was any good or anything. No, it was all dumping on Maya Sandu, the female candidate. but by the way, to complete the story, she is now the president and has won 2 successive elections because of Moldovan's success in overcoming Russian active measures, which, compared to what the Americans have faced and the Ukrainians have faced, just massive. For the Moldovans, despite their corruption, despite the oligarch, I forget his name, who pretty much owns a lot of the country, at least they got him expelled, right, and have started to reduce his influence, and managing to win 2 elections in Moldova. So she won in 2020 and 2024.
I'm speechless because, again, like you say, they managed to expel their oligarch. We're not expelling Musk. We've done this before, where we've stripped people of citizenship and
The United
expelled
States
them.
is changing its laws so he can get away with his crimes. It's the opposite of what should be done. No, yeah, little Moldova, and yes, it's a poor country. Yes, terrible problems with corruption. Older people are still with the Soviet mindset, but the young people are not. The young people are tuned in. They're able to say, we are Europe. And that's a difference from the US as well. They're able to say, look, we know we're a little country. No one cares about us unless something bad happens in our country. And our only future, well, we've got only 2 possible futures, part of Russia or part of the European Union, right? And young people know which way it's got to be. And Russia goes against it. So, given that their country is, tiny bit of it is occupied by the Russians and has been since 1992. It's just remarkable what they've been able to do.
Wow.
So, of course, to finish 2016, the next thing, of course, was the election of Trump, which was a surprise, but not really if people had been paying attention to what happened at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland that year. If they paid attention to Paul Manafort coming from, like, who is this guy, and coming on as the campaign leader. And then when he gets switched out for people like Michael Flynn and people like that, it almost doesn't matter. It's as long as there's some solid pro-Russian candidate. And what I was writing at the time as well, again, something people were not paying attention to in the United States because they had no experience of it, was a Jill Stein as a technical candidate, someone who poses as opposition, but is in fact there simply to be a spoiler, in that case, for the Hillary Clinton vote. There was another independent. Was it Johnson in that year? What was his name? Libertarian guy.
Gary Johnson?
Sounds right. Yeah. Anyway, fake opposition. And this is also something that Americans are just not used to.
Yeah.
So, and Ukrainians, for example, know perfectly, oh, that person's a technical candidate. This was part of my education as an election observer in Ukraine. I learned that, oh, there's 22 candidates for president. Yeah. And then someone says, yeah, there's only 4 real ones.
Yeah.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Jill Stein is an important reference point because votes for Jill Stein in swing states are why Hillary Clinton lost the Electoral College. A handful of states, handful of votes. So this technical candidate really ushered in this era that is so dark and bleak for America, and it's important not to forget these things. So I have a million questions, but I know, Jim, you got something that's important.
Thanks for being here, as always. I wanted to ask you, because I know, from a lot of our viewers and my friends and myself, what we're about to face is different, right? Because so far it has been mostly an external threat, pointing inward, although there have been elements inside. But now this time they will really have captured the entire government. A couple of basic questions, and I know you can't predict the future, but based on your experience with how this has gone in other countries, I wanted to just hear you talk a little bit about what, to the best of your understanding, we can expect in America. Because, there, I think, justifiably a lot of fear, but I also think that there is hope in the story of, Yanukovych. Yes, he came back amazingly, right? Even though we had the image of a poisoned man, right? It didn't matter. They elected him anyway, right?
Yeah.
So we've seen this kind of thing before, right? So I want to talk about both a little bit about what are the dangers that we face coming into this, and maybe, what are your thoughts on how do we maintain the same backbone that Ukraine did that allowed them to then, continue to stay independent.
Yeah. Well, you're right that I can't predict what will happen, but I certainly can predict the way that Russian active measures go. As I said, they're not actually all that imaginative and so on. So let's look at the U.S. political scene. So they've captured the executive, and that means that they can capture the administration. Okay. And we can see things they'll try to do. For example, Kash Patel in the FBI. If this really happens, then the FBI becomes the NKVD, and he becomes Lavrentiy Beria. This is obvious, right? That's so. And you see, are Americans prepared for that? No. Think about it. The propaganda about the FBI as being honest and true and patriotic has been around since the 1930s, right? And in movies and television, and there still are, TV shows that glorify the FBI and so on. So Americans are totally unprepared for that. The legislature, of course, it's more complicated in the US because it's a federal system, but we've already seen that having partisan control of the conduct of elections, even federal elections, gerrymandering, which is legal in the US and it's illegal in other places, pretty much unlimited financing and opaque and invisible financing, which is illegal in other places. So I think we can see that electoral systems will be even further corrupted, which gives a lock on legislatures at both levels for there. The judiciary, well, it's very top down, isn't it? And so if the Supreme Court is already captured, then that will continue indefinitely. So there's your major branches of government. The media, which is an important component of democracy, but it's overwhelmingly oligarch owned. There's no such thing as a significant public broadcaster in the United States as say in Britain or Canada and many other European countries to be a counterweight for that. The social media, of course, we know is all oligarch owned. So that will worsen because they'll be accommodating,
I'm stupidly laughing because it is so bleak.
Yeah.
It's so bleak.
So let me go with what's remaining, and that is education and the military. I'm just saying what's left of the old America. So education. Someone pointed out to me recently, and this is rather shocking, that someone who voted for the first time this time has only known the Trump era or the as a mature adult, that they actually think the things that we would think is, well, that's shocking, that is beyond the pale. They don't have that sensibility, so that they say, oh, why don't we just deport all the illegal immigrants? Okay, you're going to make concentration camps and round them up, and what about the kids who were born in the US? Oh no, we're going to deport all of them. They can just say things like that, and they have no comparison
Right.
to say, no, that's something that just cannot be done. It can't even be thought about. There's no limits there. So and we know Trump's threats about education and related to funding and so on. And see, that's a real weakness. People can do what they want if they can be privately educated, but when it's public education, And I think the last, you mentioned in our comments before we started this about law enforcement, and I think we can see that that has already been significantly corrupted. When you can get sheriffs and chiefs of police to overwhelmingly endorse a convicted criminal and dump on a seasoned prosecutor, you know that they're too far gone. So my prediction is that the last holdout of the old America will be the military. People who serve honorably, who make sacrifices in their personal life or even greater sacrifices in times of conflict, because they're honorable people, because they're patriotic and they have a sense of duty. That will be the last institution that will go. And the way it will go is, of course, top down. You replace the chief of staff, you replace these with political toadies.
Fox News host, for example.
Yeah. Sure. Why not? Why not? Make a Fox News host the chief of staff, and that way you can very quickly corrupt the American military. So, and as many people have observed, it's not even, this is even special to Russia. It is the fascist playbook.
So how did Ukraine, for example, I imagine all of these pressures on all of these same institutions, in your experience, what is the, and this may be even more of a spiritual question, and I'm not a spiritual person exactly, but what is it that kept Ukraine as a nation and has kept other countries that have worked through similar kind of takeovers? Give us a little bit of hope about how we might be able to hold on in this situation.
Starting with just knowing your own history, which is something lacking in the United States. Don't forget, if you talk to Ukrainian and they'll talk about what's happening now, they can easily talk about what happened in the 1950s when the Ukrainian insurgent army was fighting the NKVD. Or they can say, oh, let's talk back to the early 1920s when the Ukrainian National Republic was fighting the Bolshevik invaders. And they'll say, oh, remember the student cadets who fought at Kruti in 1918. And everyone else said, what? It's some minor little battle in the middle of World War I. So, no, incredibly significant to Ukrainians because they lost that battle, but they put up a fight against overwhelming odds. And for a time, they actually saved Kiev as a result. And they could go further back than that. The Ukrainians almost boast about how, everything has a precedent and so on. And don't forget, Ukraine was completely conquered. They were subjected to a genocide, which killed anywhere between 6 and 11 million people in 1932, 1933. But Ukrainians know these stories. And when people naively say, oh, Ukraine, they refer to it as a post-Soviet country, something which anyone from Eastern Europe absolutely hates because it is just such a meaningless thing to say. And a Ukrainian would say, do you know that Ukraine was practicing democracy 1,000 years ago? Village councils making decisions about who would be the leader and, this kind of thing, as many, even more primitive societies were doing. And with that democratic foundation, they never had a king, they had a prince who was supported by a council of nobles who were basically elected nobles, much like Poland also had. Anyway, and I like to think, Ukraine in the 10th century, Kiev was a golden dome capital. And what was Western Europe like in the 10th century? A bunch of minor kings living in wooden longhouses and fighting amongst themselves, kind of thing. But if you look 1,000 years ago, the two tiny shining cities of Europe were Constantinople, today Istanbul, and Kiev. But Ukrainians know those stories. It's not like they're boasting about it. Oh, we're great and we'll be that empire again. Ukraine's never been an empire. They said, no, where are we now? We're a large country in area, but small in geopolitical significance. Our place is in Europe. Our place cannot be with Russia, because we know all about this, and we're going to fight, and we're going to bring our democratic values with us, and so on, and we're going to do it despite all the odds. Like I always say, that Ukrainians would fight whether the Americans gave them weapons or not. And we know that because they did fight when the Americans were not giving them weapons.
Right. Right.
So your question, though, was about what Americans can take from that. And I think it starts with just an openness, which Americans historically have not had, but somehow they've got to do it, to realize, yes, the United States is large. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's powerful in all these ways. But to its enemies, it's just another campaign. It's just another target. And to understand that respect, I've always said to people, yes, you have your own concerns and they're important and you feel aggrieved about something, but can you just stop for a minute and instead of repeating it, say, what does Putin think about that? And how are Russians manipulating that sentiment?
Yes.
Like a good example we mentioned earlier about Jill Stein and how they were able to derail the Green movement. Well, the Green Party is a valid political concern there, but it's not really a Green Party in the United States because of what they were able to do with top-down manipulation. By the Green Party in Germany, for example, is extremely pro-Ukraine, more so than the Christian Democratic Union or the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. I really wish that the Greens had more power than they did in the coalition. Maybe they will in the future. But that's totally opposite of the States. But that's because the Russians can find some schism and skew it their own way. A minor point related to the Greens that I was talking about many years ago was the argument against fracking. And there's many good arguments that Greens can make, and we should listen to them and adjust our policies. But the Russians poured money into it because they don't have fracking there in Russia, and they wanted their oil industry to dominate. And they realized that what was happening, the U.S., with more oil production, becoming a net exporter, which was a surprise to everybody. Everyone thought that it was on the way out. And some of it is to do with that, but you realize that, okay, you on the one hand, you can have your environmental concern, and you should, and maybe we shouldn't be doing fracking, but what are the Russians doing, and why are they doing it?
And how do they benefit?
And how do they benefit from that? And it's very difficult to separate that kind of things because people are so emotional and attached to their own ideas and perceptions, and just to do a great example of how people can do this. I'm sure all of us follow Julia Davis and her wonderful work monitoring Russian.
The national hero. She's
incredible.
And look how simple it is. This is what's on Russian TV. This is what millions of Russians think is what the world is like, and she just translates it. But more than that, she gives the sense and meaning. What it mean, because only a native speaker can do that.
Right.
And if we're just going to retreat into our own illusions, what we think about it, we'll be making a mistake. We should be listening to her, or what she's telling us Russians are thinking and saying, because that is it. And that's why I've always also wanted to present the Ukrainian point of view, and also simply do war reporting to say, look, what's really happening on the front, kind of thing, because that is important. And when I read comments about how discussions at high political levels are really still in the pre-2014 world of, what does people think about this? And I just like, no, who cares? It's what's happening, what's the right thing to do, how do we, move forward, adjust our way of thinking? And it just starts with, at least for a moment, thinking what our enemies are thinking. How are they manipulating us?
Thank you so much.
Appeasement,
Yes.
appeasement it seems to be the hope and dream of all failing nations, right? Is that we can appease a fascist. Thank you so much for that.
Yes,
Sorry, go
thank you. Thank you
ahead.
both so much for that. I know Hi-Fi has a question next. I just wanted to say that I had friends visiting from Germany, and we did a toast, and I heard myself say these words: to the corpse of America, may it decompose quickly and reincarnate into something beautiful. And that made me really sad that I said that. And I actually tweeted it out and then deleted it because I don't want to believe it. But I don't know, other than what you just said. I mean, we've said on this show a million times, Russia, Russia, Russia was very effective propaganda. And we still need to punch through it. And that's what we try to do on this show week after week after week for years now. And you have really given us a lot of tools to work with. I'm going to actually, with your permission, print the list that you gave to High Fidelity on all the countries that have faced this. To Russia, we're just another campaign. To our enemies, we're just another campaign. That is something we cannot wrap our head around. High Fidelity.
Dr. MacKay, great to see you again as always, sir. I do have to disagree with something you said earlier, though. You said Americans don't pay attention to Moldova. I am an American. I pay attention to Moldova. And I saw this lovely little report the other day that ties a Russian operative to the Russian billionaire in the UK, Roman Abramovich. And he was funding this man and paying for everything. And all right, so one of the things I like to do is I like to identify the weapons that are being used by Russia in hybrid warfare. And when I say weapons, I don't mean bullets and bombs and things like that. No, I mean things like we know that Facebook was a weapon for Donald Trump and Russia in 2016. We know in 2020, 2024, Twitter was a weapon for Donald Trump and Russia. But we also know that Roman Abramovich is a weapon for Russia. We know that Robert Mercer, an American billionaire, is a weapon for Russia. Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. We know in Ukraine, Medvedchuk was a billionaire that was weaponized for Russia. How do we get it across to people that Russia, with their hybrid warfare, which is just warfare, they are weaponizing people to destroy countries, specifically billionaires?
How do we make people aware of that? It's very difficult to overcome, for example, a part of the American dream, which is to aspire to be people like this, to aspire to be wealthy and, going back
I blame
to
Horatio Alger.
Horatio Alger, yes. I was just going to say about that. No one's read the story, but people know it as a as a quick shortcut for that idea. So from the humble beginnings and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's more extensive in the US. For example, there's a certain admiration for gangsters, for being, um, plucky and daring and courageous and so on, and it's just kind of glaze over that they're criminals. Uh, and that's a part of popular culture as well. So it's extremely difficult, but I think you just have to pierce the bubble. Point out that Elon Musk is not a Horatio Alger. He inherited wealth, or as I've said before, and you've been gracious enough to quote me, Trump is a fake rich guy. Um, and so, and
And you taught me Trump is a fake rich guy because all money launderers are fake rich guys.
No,
That was a very
The
important
money
lesson.
laundering.
Yeah.
The money laundering.
Yeah, and to do this kind of thing, like you mentioned about Medvedchuk, who of course now is in hiding in Russia, but another prominent Ukrainian oligarch that the Russians bought was Pinchuk. Now he's hiding out in Austria, and because the Austrian government and judiciary is corrupt to a certain extent, he's been more than a decade dodging extradition to the U.S. Kind of thing. But just to point out that there is something to these charges, that it's not all political and so on. But it's extremely difficult to do. I think, what was the poll recently, that like a majority of Americans were not aware that Trump is a convicted felon. Just so when basics like that are there. So I don't think I have a good answer about how to counter this kind of thing, other than to try to pierce the bubble and positively to try to get across an alternative point of view, which is the democratic spirit, that all people who are citizens have a voice and a say, and that a billionaire should be one among many. And this is, and to get across the idea why it is wrong that there be this idea of presidential immunity, for example, why it is wrong that someone with a lot of money to invest should be immune from the rules of other people, why it is wrong that people who are wealthier actually pay less tax proportionally than people who are poor, and so on. So a positive assertion of democratic values, and to somehow reconnect American patriotism to democratic values. And that, with that link broken, unfortunately, all things are possible, including a descent into full fascism. But if you can reconnect what it is to be an American, is to believe in democracy, to believe in fairness, to believe in honesty in news and in politics as a value, and to believe that justice is a goal worth pursuing in public life. These used to be the ideals to which the United States aspires, always realizing that it never truly achieved it, but there's always work to be done. But to have those ideals again, and I see if you're not even mentioning these things as ideals, like, again, the disconnect of especially young people, like, would they have any idea what Lyndon Johnson meant by the Just Society? And no clue.
Yeah.
If they ever heard it in a history class in high school, they've forgotten it, kind of thing. Again, I'm generalizing. I know I'm not talking to an audience that knows exactly what I'm talking about, but
yeah, no, it's all so important. I keep reflecting back on know your history, know your history. The fact that we not only don't know it, we deny it, has allowed us to be exploited by bad actors away from all the things that are meaningful to
and this is
patriots
why,
like this
unfortunately,
team.
I'm more pessimistic about the US than these other countries, because in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia right now, so Georgia, we're very active in these demos every day. The young people are tied into the democratic spirit, patriotism, tied in with nationalism against Russian opposition. And it's the older people with the nostalgia, and who are also more easily bought off. You can just give, because of poverty, you can just give people some money and they'll show up at a demo or things like that. But in the United States, there's an inversion of that. It's the older people who remember the old politics. If people who remember that the Republican Party used to be a conservative party, if there's any, but what about the young people? It's not the same. It's not part of their language. It's not part of their instinct. Again, there's exceptions, and we've got to support that. I'll just give you a quick little anecdote of one of my times in Ukraine, and I was invited to speak to a bunch of young people at a kind of internet cafe drop-in center. It was very active in the discussion group. And they wanted me to talk about what had happened in the 90s with the rise of the oligarchs, but the beginnings of a more modern civil society in Ukraine, because they were all too young at the time. So I started to talk about that, and the discussion got kind of taken over because they wanted to talk about what was happening with the Revolution of Dignity. And I kind of sat back and said, this is great. Like,
Yeah.
Why should I go on with this kind of stuff when you've got these really immediate concerns? The Russians are now invading. This is really important. These young people are saying, hey, am I going to join a volunteer battalion and fight or not?
Yeah,
I said,
right.
well, that's kind of more important than what I had to say about this.
Wow.
And I was just delighted to kind of sit back and be a part of this. And I
Wow.
would just so love the same thing to happen in the United States, that young people take charge, that reject this politics of anger and resentment. But when I don't see it, with enough weight to drive events, it makes me quite discouraged.
We are, we're right there with you. And with the minute or two we have left, if you could wave that magic wand, we have a month. What would be like if you could lead us out of this by January 20th or even post January 20th? What are the first 3 or 4 things that we would need to do? There are people who want to do something, but they don't have any direction on what to do.
Oh, what could Biden do very easily right now? He could say, the United States supports the immediate admission of Ukraine to NATO. Simple. Other countries have done it. Many countries have done it. So the United States supports the immediate admission of Ukraine to NATO. Forget all this, membership action program. No, that's for peacetime. Admit Ukraine the same way West Germany, a divided country, was admitted in 1956. The way that Turkey and Greece were admitted together, even though neither one of them really qualified at the time. Another. All restrictions on the use of weapons are lifted. It's up to the armed forces of Ukraine to decide how best to defend their country. Right? Simple. A simple decision. Third, the Russian Federation is a terrorist state. Or if the law currently says you have to call it a state sponsor of terrorism, fine, you do that. Okay? So again, a simple thing. Congress has already passed many measures to say do that. So stroke of a pen, he could do that. There you go. There's 3 quick things he could do that would make a massive difference because they would carry other countries along. And make a huge difference. Don't forget, Russia is banking on, they're engaged in a massive offensive right now, and they're going all out. They're paying no attention to their losses until January 20th, because they're betting everything that Trump will surrender Ukraine for them. Now, however unrealistic that may be, that is what they're thinking, and so they're sacrificing between 1,000 and 1,500 men every day. Killed or seriously wounded, equipment, just incredible losses. And they're gaining a couple hundred meters here and there every day because, you can't hold out against that. But also Russia can't continue it forever. But they said, no, we just have to continue it for 1 more month. So that's happening right now.
I just have one final thing I want to ask you about. The Helsinki Commission recently released a report on Russia's shadow war and identified 150 different operations, as you see here. Quite a few in the United States, obviously. What is keeping Biden from acting?
Nothing. Nothing is keeping him from acting. He has a duty to defend the United States. It is actually his first duty.
Yes.
It's his first duty, and nothing is stopping it other than just a failure of vision to realize what's going on and how the catastrophe is here. You know, people say things like, "Oh, you need Congress to declare war," or something. It's like, no, you simply just say this is what's happening. Russia is at war. This is the nature of the war. These are the campaigns of the war, and it also puts Trump in a box about where he stands in all this kind of thing. You know, why he doesn't do it even just for political expediency is completely beyond me.
Wow.
And
Wow.
look, Supreme Court made him immune. You know, and he doesn't use it in a way that Trump is certainly going to do it. Yeah. So I just don't understand it. I think history will be very harsh on him. That's no consolation to us now.
No. Unless he does what you just said, which he could do today, next week.
Yeah.
So now we actually have our marching orders, don't we, gentlemen? We are going to be writing the 3 things that he needs to do and can do immediately, which Jim has, been writing, and I've been writing, and High Fidelity has been writing, and we continue to do it. But now I feel like we have a very succinct direction and where to apply pressure. Last thing, people are in despair. Despair is the enemy of action. What would you recommend American people who understand the severity of this, what we call a decapitation strike, this fascist creep here? What would you say to Americans to kind of get them out of despair and into some form of action?
Look around you. Look at other people who are worse off than you are right now. Look at Ukrainians who, during an air raid, will be down in the metro in Kiev, and there's no power. Well, there's power in the metro, but there's no power in their homes. They're there instead of being at work or school or going about their day because of the threat from drones, especially, and they're they're on their phones, they're singing, they're chatting, and they're making plans, they're living. So there's people who worse off than you, and they've overcome, and they have hope. Ukrainians say, "We trust in the armed forces of Ukraine." They contribute more voluntarily. Money. They're not rich people, but they contribute massive amounts. Where are all these drones coming from? Some from Western partners, but the overwhelmingly are domestically produced kind of things, and those turn the tide of the war. So look at Georgians right now out in the street of Tbilisi with security forces attacking them every night. Titushki thugs beating up journalists and so on. They still come out every night in bigger and bigger numbers. They put the regime on the back foot. I mean, so Americans just have to look around and say, there's other people, they've faced this a lot longer than Americans have. I know it's a shock. It's unexpected. Americans don't know how to deal with it. Look about how other people do and how they keep hope. It's difficult. It's very difficult to, keep hope when your school has been bombed and you can't go to your school anymore. And you're talking to your teachers on a laptop kind of thing, but you keep hope anyway. You still go to school. You still do what you can.
Thank you.